Don't pack your suitcase. I already hid it. Those words froze Grace in her tracks. She turned and found Noah curled up inside the closet, clutching her bag with trembling little arms. He was just a child, but somehow he knew. He knew she was planning to leave. And right then, something inside her cracked wide open. What kind of love forces a child to guard a suitcase like it's life or death? What kind of choice makes someone weigh their future against the only family they've ever truly felt? Stay with this story, because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you understood about love, sacrifice, and the cost of choosing your heart. Clara Bennett had never stood up to a billionaire before. But here she was, facing Julian Sinclair in the towering living room of his cold, cathedral-like estate. His stare was ice, sharp, calculating, and dangerous. Still, she didn't flinch. "Sir," she said, voice calm but unwavering, "your son isn't autistic. He just needs someone to love him." Her words cut through the room like a blade. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet tick of Andrew's expensive wristwatch. And then, the explosion. "How dare you?" he growled, his voice low and controlled, but deadly. 36 specialists disagree. You're dismissed. Pack your things and get out of my house." The floor beneath Grace seemed to shift. She needed this job. Desperately. It was her only way to support her grandmother Mavis and her younger sister Ruby back in Maple Hollow. But even more than money, what broke her was the thought of leaving Noah, the boy who had stared up at her that morning with those wide, silent, pleading eyes. As she bent to gather his toys from the marble floor, her hands shook. Getting fired? That she could live with. But watching a 4-year-old boy be treated like a malfunctioning machine? That was the real crime. Across the room, the therapist who'd triggered Noah's meltdown stood gloating, tablet in hand. She didn't care. None of them did. To them, Noah was just another file. Another problem to manage. Grace had nearly reached the door when it happened. A small voice rang out. "Daddy, don't let Grace go." The words came soft, almost a whisper. But they stopped the world. Everyone in the room froze. Julian turned slowly, as if the ground beneath him had just shifted. And there stood Noah, eyes glassy, cheeks wet, clinging to his father's leg. The boy who hadn't spoken a full sentence in over a year had just said 7 perfect words. The therapist's tablet slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a loud crack. Grace held her breath. The whole mansion seemed to exhale at once, then fall silent again. Julia knelt, stunned. "Noah, what did you just say?" Noah looked up at him with pure, innocent desperation. "I want Grace to stay. She makes the monsters go away." And just like that, the man who had built empires with logic and flattened competitors with words had none left to say. Grace, still trembling, knew what she had just witnessed. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't chance. It was a miracle. Only 2 weeks earlier, she had first stepped out of a cab at Hawthorne Estate. Her thrift store flats squeaked against the mansion's gleaming stone floors. Everything about the house was massive, intimidating. The silence inside, even more so, cold, clinical. Mrs. Winslow, the longtime housekeeper, looked her over with polite suspicion. The last nanny walked out without a word. The woman muttered, flipping through Grace's resume. "Mr. Sinclair needs someone qualified. His son is complicated. I have experience with special needs children," Grace replied, handing over her early childhood education certification. "He was diagnosed with autism last year. His mother died giving birth to him," Hargrove added, her voice tight. "And Mr. Sinclair is particular." What she didn't say, but Grace would come to understand, was that Julian Sinclair didn't run a home. He ran a boardroom. Efficient, quiet, and entirely without warmth. The first time Grace saw Noah, he was sitting alone in the garden, lining up toy cars in perfect rows while a white-coated therapist stood nearby, taking notes from a distance. No interaction, no touch, no words, just observation. And something about that loneliness hit Grace like a punch to the chest. It reminded her of herself as a child, after her parents died, staring out a window, too young to grieve, too aware to feel safe. When Julian Sinclair finally entered the room, she recognized him immediately, not from magazines or business headlines, but from the emptiness behind his eyes. He was tall, sharp, polished, and utterly unreachable. "Can you start today?" he asked, his tone flat and indifferent. He'd barely looked up from his phone. "Can you start today?" Julian asked, his voice flat, barely above a sigh. The entire interview hadn't even lasted half a minute. "Stick to the therapist's routine. Don't deviate. Don't interrupt me while I'm working." And just like that, Grace was hired. And just like that, she understood why every nanny before her had walked away. In the days that followed, Grace watched helplessly as the therapist treated Noah like a problem to solve. A rigid routine, endless reward charts, emotionless observations. No eye contact, no hugs, no stories, no songs, no warmth. To them, he was a diagnosis in a tiny body. But Grace saw something different. So she broke the rules. Quietly, gently. She sang lullabies from her Vermont hometown while rinsing shampoo from Noah's curls. She told him bedtime stories about turtles and thunderstorms and magic spoons. She held him when he screamed, not as punishment, but protection. And something shifted. He started to hum with her. He reached for her hand. He made eye contact, real, soul-deep connection. He was waking up. Until that day in the therapy room. The day the specialist pushed too hard. Noah panicked, screamed. The therapist frowned and barked at Grace. Call Mr. Sinclair. He needs to see this disruptive behavior. But Grace had reached her limit. Enough charts. Enough checklists. She stood her ground, heart racing. Your son doesn't need more schedules, she said, voice steady. He needs love. No one in that house had ever dared say it. But she did. And now here they were, Noah begging his father not to let her go. Julian rose slowly, smoothing the crease from his suit like he was trying to steady himself. His voice was even, controlled. You may stay, he said to Grace. For now. But his eyes had changed. You'll follow every medical directive, he added. And I want surveillance in Noah's room. I'll be watching. Grace nodded, concealing the rush of relief tightening in her chest. Then Julian turned to the therapist. I want a full report on what just happened. On my desk. Tomorrow. Grace dropped to her knees beside Noah. His tiny fingers clung to her sleeve like she was the only anchor left in his world. Thank you for standing up for me, champ, she whispered. You're the bravest boy I know. For the first time, Noah looked her square in the eyes. It was quiet, barely a second, but it felt like a crack of sunlight in a locked room. Later that night, as Grace tucked him into bed, something caught her eye in the corner, a faint red light. A new camera. Watching. Recording. Judging. She glanced at it and smiled. Let me ask you something. If standing up for love might cost you everything, would you still do it? Grace had. And now, that blinking red light above Noah's bed was a reminder. Julian Sinclair was always watching. But she didn't let it stop her. She still sang him soft lullabies, the kind her grandmother used to hum on stormy nights. She still combed his little curls gently after his bath. She still whispered silly bedtime stories into his ear as he drifted off, clinging to the edge of sleep. The mansion stayed cold, sterile, like a museum of wealth. But in that quiet bedroom, something had started to bloom. Trust. Warmth. Tiny sparks of something Grace hadn't dared to name yet. In the days that followed, Grace walked a tightrope. When the therapists were present, she played by their rules, rigid schedules, token charts, no touch, no eye contact. She followed the script like a pro. But the moment they left, she returned to what she knew in her bones. She played soft music on the old Bluetooth speaker, taught Noah how to hum along to the melody. One day, she caught him clapping his hands, offbeat, wild, joyful. It hit her so hard she cried. In the pantry, where no one would see. Then came the moment of magic. One afternoon, while reorganizing Noah's closet, she discovered a dusty old box shoved behind winter coats. Inside, a collection of unopened musical toys. Among them, a tiny plastic flute. She wiped off the dust, walked into the kitchen, and offered it to Noah after lunch. Want to try? She asked, casually. To her surprise, he grabbed it without hesitation, blew into it with squeaky, unfiltered glee. You're a natural. She laughed, clapping along with his chaotic tune. That night, she did something bold. She sneaked her grandfather's old guitar into the house. It was beat up, scratched, and the wood had dulled with time, but the strings still held a tune. After dinner, she sat on the rug with Noah and played quietly. He didn't move, just watched her, eyes wide and still. Would you like to learn? She asked, her voice soft as a lullaby. She asked the question with quiet care. Noah didn't say a word, but he nodded, as glued to her hands as they moved along the guitar strings like magic. What neither of them realized was that they weren't alone. Margaret Sinclair had returned early from her European trip, and through the half-open door, she had been watching. Silent, stone-faced, her expression carved from marble. The moment she stepped into the room, the warmth shattered. The music died. What is going on in here? She snapped, voice sharp as glass. These toys are not part of Noah's therapeutic program. Grace stood up fast, instinctively. Good afternoon, Mrs. Sinclair. We were just... I know exactly what you were doing, the older woman cut in. You were interfering with a medical regimen designed by professionals. Before Grace could respond, another voice rang out from the hallway. I authorized it, Julian said. He walked in calmly, hands in his pockets, gaze unreadable. He'd been watching too through the cameras. Margaret spun toward him. Andrew, she hissed. This woman is undermining progress. He didn't flinch. What progress, mother? His voice was steady, but something had shifted in his tone. For over a year, Noah barely said a word. He cried through every session. Now, he plays music. He speaks. He smiles. So maybe, just maybe, it's not the charts and color-coded routines doing the work. For the first time, Grace saw Margaret hesitate. Her eyes drifted to Noah, who clutched the toy flute like it was armor. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice softer now. Maybe, Julian replied. But for once, I'm willing to make it. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in. The wind howled. Rain hammered the mansion's tall windows. The lights flickered, twice, before steadying again. Grace was reading a worn paperback in the hallway when a sharp cry rang out from Noah's room. She dropped the book and bolted in. He was huddled under his blanket, shaking, eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," she whispered, sliding beside him on the bed. "It's just the rain." Without a word, he crawled into her lap and buried his face into her shirt. She hummed a melody, low and soothing, the same one her mother used to sing during storms in Vermont. As his sobs began to soften, she leaned closer and whispered, "Chocolate helps." Then she smiled gently. "Want to make some?" Noah looked up at her and gave a tiny nod. They padded down the hallway on tiptoes, the storm still growling outside. In the kitchen, Grace moved like muscle memory, heating milk on the stove, sprinkling in cinnamon just like her grandmother always had. As they stirred the cocoa together, the quiet rhythm was broken by a soft cough from behind. Startled, she turned. Julian was leaning in the doorway, wearing a robe over his pajamas, his expression unreadable. "Noah had a nightmare," Grace explained gently. "We're making hot chocolate." There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, Julian crossed the room and pulled out a stool. "Mind if I join?" Grace blinked, surprised. "Of course not," she said. So there they sat, the three of them, huddled in the glow of the dim kitchen lights, sipping cocoa while thunder rolled across the sky. Noah had a chocolate mustache, and when he looked up grinning, something broke through in Andrew. He laughed. A real, unguarded laugh. Watching his son, Julian murmured to no one in particular, "This feels like something we lost a long time ago." A few days later, after persistent nudging from Grace, Julian finally agreed to a second medical evaluation for Noah. The new specialist spent hours with the boy, this time without clipboards or cold stares. Instead, there was play, gentle questions, eye contact. At the end of the session, the doctor sat down across from Grace and Andrew, folding his hands. "Mr. Sinclair," he began, "your son does not meet the diagnostic criteria for classic autism." Grace's breath caught. "His behavior aligns more closely with selective mutism, likely trauma-induced. What he needs isn't more medication. What he needs is emotional stability. Safe, consistent connection. And from what I've seen, he's already responding." Julian didn't reply. He simply stared through the glass wall into the next room, where Noah sat tapping at a small xylophone, humming softly to himself. The doctor added, almost as an afterthought, "And the person he's responding to might already be sitting beside you." On the drive back to the mansion, silence hung between them like fog. Then, Julian finally spoke, his hands tied on the wheel, his voice low. "You were right," he said. "About all of it." Grace didn't say a word. She just stared out the window, heart thudding in her chest. That night, as she tucked Noah in, he looked at her with those wide, honest eyes. "Are you going to stay?" he asked quietly. She knelt beside his bed. "Do you want me to?" He nodded and whispered, "You make the house less scary." Her throat tightened. As she closed the door behind her, she found Julian standing in the hallway, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Parenting. Feelings. Trust. Any of it." He paused, then added quietly, "But I want to try." Grace didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything at all. She simply nodded and walked past Julian into the quiet. But as she moved through the halls of Hawthorne Estate that night, something felt different. The mansion hadn't changed, but something inside it had. For the first time, the cold walls felt like they might be holding space for something real. And maybe, just maybe, love was starting to breathe where logic used to live. What if someone told you that love could heal what medicine couldn't? Would you believe them? Or walk away? It happened in the soft light of early morning. Grace was folding Noah's tiny shirts in the nursery when she noticed something missing. His small travel bag gone. Frowning, she opened the closet wider. That's when she saw him, curled up in the corner, holding the suitcase like it was a life raft, tears streaking his cheeks. Her heart stopped. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. "I don't want you to leave," Noah choked out, his voice raw. "I hid your bag. If you can't pack, you won't go." Grace froze, breath caught in her throat. She had never said a word about the job in Aurora Springs. Not once. But somehow, Noah had known. Moments later, footsteps approached. Julian appeared in the doorway, and his eyes went wide at the sight of his son on the closet floor, clutching the suitcase like it might keep her there. Grace stood slowly, trying to swallow the knot forming in her throat. The three of them stood in silent stillness, something unspoken hanging heavy in the air. For the first time, the lines had blurred. They weren't just nanny, father, and child anymore. They were something closer, something more fragile. A family, quietly breaking apart. For the next 3 days, Hawthorne Estate was a mansion wrapped in silence. Grace stayed, but hardly spoke a word to Andrew. She poured herself into Noah, helping him with word puzzles, laughing through pancake batter spills, dancing to his favorite music like nothing was wrong. But at night, the offer from Aurora Springs sat untouched in her drawer like a question she was afraid to answer. Stay for love? Or leave for security? She wasn't sure anymore. Then, one morning, Julia knocked softly and asked her to come into the nursery. "Noah, can you go see Mrs. Daxton for a bit?" he asked gently. Noah looked between them, hesitated, then nodded and slipped out the door. Julian turned to Grace. His face was unreadable. "I'm leaving tonight," he said simply. "I'm leaving tonight," Julian said abruptly, no explanation, no build-up. Grace's heart missed a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm going on a short trip. 2 days, he replied, steady but distant. There's something I need to take care of for us. I know I should explain more, but right now, I need you to trust me. He paused, then added with quiet urgency, please, don't make any decisions until I'm back. And just like that, he was gone. That night, Grace lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling as raindrops tapped softly against the windows. She tried to focus on practical things. The job offer in Aurora Springs, the salary, the promise of security, the clean break. But every time her eyes fell on Noah, curled up beside her, his tiny hand wrapped around hers like an anchor, her resolve cracked. Her heart splintered. The next evening, as rain continued to patter against the glass, her phone rang. It was Ruby, and she was crying. Grace, she sobbed through the receiver, I got it. The scholarship. Full ride. Everything. Tuition, books, housing. I'm going to be a doctor. Tears spilled down Grace's face before she could even reply. Years of sacrifice. Years of scraping by to keep Ruby's dreams alive. And now it had all paid off. For the first time, Grace didn't have to choose survival over love. She could finally choose for herself. Later that night, as she passed through the dimly lit hallway, Grace noticed a figure waiting in the shadows. Margaret Sinclair. I'd like a word, the older woman said, her tone cool and clipped. Grace followed her into the study, where Margaret poured 2 glasses of wine without a word and handed one over. I've been watching, Margaret said, voice calm but measured. Lucas, Noah, is brighter, happier, and that's because of you. Grace stayed silent, unsure whether she was hearing gratitude or the opening move in another cold negotiation. I also know about the job offer, Margaret continued, and I won't stop you if you decide to take it. She took a sip of her wine. In fact, I've arranged something better. Higher pay. One of the top private academies in the country. It's far from here, of course, but it's a clean slate. Grace blinked, stunned. You're trying to buy me out. I'm giving you an exit, Margaret replied smoothly, before things get messy. Before hearts break. Grace stood, her voice firm and steady now. I didn't come here to break hearts, Mrs. Sinclair. I came for a job. But somewhere along the way, I found something else. Your son. Your grandson. A home. Her eyes didn't waver. I'm not walking away from that just because it makes things complicated. Grace walked out of the study, heart pounding like a drum. She never noticed the rare softness in Margaret Sinclair's expression as she disappeared down the hallway. 2 days later, just before dawn, the front gates of the estate creaked open. Julian had returned. But instead of walking through the grand front entrance, he stood quietly by the garden steps, holding something wrapped in a bundle of cloth. Grace had just stepped outside when she spotted him. I went to Maple Hollow, Julian said gently, to see your grandmother. He paused, then continued. She told me a story about a man who gave up his fortune for the woman he loved, about building something from nothing, brick by brick, across 2 very different worlds. Then he unwrapped the cloth. Inside were architectural plans. I sold the mansion, he said, watching her reaction. Bought a piece of land halfway between here and Maple Hollow. We're going to build something new there. A real home. Something that belongs to all of us. He took a breath. And I want you to help me build it. Not just the house, Grace. Everything. Her breath caught in her throat. There's more, he added softly. I started a foundation for children like Noah. Inspired by you. The Sinclair Bennett Center for Child Development. And if you say yes, I want you to help me run it. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could speak. But only if you stay, Julian whispered. Not as an employee. Not as a guest. As my partner. In every way. Then, slowly, he dropped to one knee. Clara Bennett, will you build a life with me? From the doorway, a small figure appeared. Noah. He was holding the toy flute Grace had given him that very first week. He raised it to his lips, played one squeaky note, then whispered with a shy smile, say yes. Grace laughed through her tears. Yes, she said. Yes to everything. Months passed. Their new house began to rise like a promise out of the soil. Noah's laughter echoed through half-finished hallways, like music made of light. One spring afternoon, beneath the jacaranda tree Julian had insisted on replanting from the old estate, the 3 of them sat together, Grace, Andrew, and Noah, drawing their future into the dirt with sticks. They didn't need headlines or applause. They had chosen each other, and it had all started the day Grace dared to look into the eyes of a powerful man and say, your son doesn't need a diagnosis. He just needs love. And now, love was what they lived in, loud, messy, imperfect, but completely real. What about you? Do you believe love can heal what medicine can't? If this story touched your heart, type 77 in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to share this story with someone who could use a little hope today.